Bars Can't Hold Us by Laura of Matoria. Chapter 6. Keith's awareness slowly returned. He felt himself surrounded by warmth, a wall of breathing and kindness. Hunk and Lance were both beside him, holding him close. It felt nice. His body ached and burned, a somewhat familiar pain, but there was so much of it, too much. He'd felt the ache and burn of cuts and bruises before, but never so deeply and so widespread. He remembered being in this room with Hunk and Lance, remembered Hunk's hands fastened to the floor. Lance gone, then Lance returned. Lance had been bleeding from the nose, a flow of dark red that just wouldn't stop. He'd been unconscious, too, for far too long, and when he woke, he was limp and confused. Hunk and Keith had cradled him between them, supporting him while Lance came back to himself. Now Hunk and Lance were doing the same for him. Keith remembered being taken, remembered a table, his arms being strapped down, then faces appearing before his vision, and a blade. A voice asked questions, and he bolted his mouth shut and refused to answer. The blade cut him. Shallowly at first, he made no sound. Another question. Another cut. It kept happening. Eventually, everything began to blur. But it hadn't been that hard to resist, really. Once Keith figured out a way to ride through the pain, to ignore it, to repress it the way he often repressed his unpleasant emotions. Once it worked once, he just had to keep doing it. After a while, the torture became almost boring. They asked a question. He kept his mouth shut. They heard him. It did build up eventually. The pain of each cut did not disappear after they inflicted it. It accumulated. Keith kept having to ignore more and more, pushing it all under like sweeping trash under a rug. Eventually, the pile became too big, and he was forced to acknowledge that it was there. He wanted to sweep it out the door instead, but more kept being shoveled in. It was all he could do to keep up. By that time, the pain was almost unbearable. He was getting close to making a noise, though he still knew that he would never say a word. Still, making a noise would be a kind of failure, too. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to refuse them absolutely, completely, give them no satisfaction at all for what they were doing to him. No reaction. No reaction. But they cut too deep. He felt the blood leaving his body, dizziness overtaking him as his strength leaked away. His consciousness was failing. Soon he would not be able to speak at all, not by conscious choice, but because his mouth would not be able to move. That was when they tired of their fruitless quest. "Take him back to the cell," someone said. Corrales. "We'll try the yellow one again."
"Should we treat the wounds?" a male voice asked. "He bleeds more freely than a Malcordon. It might be too much."
Corrales snorted. "Let his fellows care for him. It will give them something to do, keep their minds off trying to escape."
"Yes, Commander."
Keith felt a hand on the side of his face and tried to jerk his head away. Corrales' touch followed him, burning, inescapable. She leaned down to speak into his ear, and Keith blinked at her, dazed. "You will never escape," Corrales said, soft and low and very, very certain. "Don't bother trying. It's a waste of energy. And you and your fellow pilots need to conserve every bit of energy you have. Why do you think we haven't fed you? Haven't given you water? It's better if you're weak. You'll break eventually. We'll never stop hurting you until you give us what you want." She was right, in a way. Keith needed to conserve his energy for moments like this. He stared into her face, chest heaving hard enough that he could feel every cut and gash that pierced his flesh. He worked his jaw for a moment, gathering up the strength, then spat into her face. Corrales jerked back, eyes closing for a moment. Her expression did not change, since it had already been practically demonic. But she turned wordlessly away and took the knife from the soldier who had been holding it, and she cut him again across his stomach, deep, too deep. Keith convulsed against his bonds, mouth opening and closing helplessly, silently. Then she stood back and watched him bleed. She moved back to his head, grabbed a fistful of his hair. She dragged his head up as far as the straps would allow, then slammed it down on the table. "That's the consequence of defying me," she said calmly. "Never forget I can do whatever I like to you. Anything at all. To you, to the blue pilot, the yellow pilot. When we're done with you, we'll make you forget and dump you by the road somewhere for your leader to find. But we'll break you first. That I swear. You cannot escape." Keith blinked. His vision was blurring in and out.
"Leave Hunk and Lance alone,"
he rasped out, the first words he'd said since they took him from the cell. She regarded him steadily. "No." She walked away. The other Malcordons undid the bonds, lifted him up by the arms, and dragged him back to the cell. As he had on the way in, he tried to look around, tried to memorize the layout so when they got out or when Shiro came for them, he would know where to go. But his vision was tilting, blurring in and out, and nothing seemed to be working right. Then they finally gave him back to Lance and Hunk, and Keith stopped forcing himself to be silent. It was a relief to make noise, even a little bit, though he still tried to suppress it to an extent so he wouldn't worry Lance too much. It didn't work. Lance was worried. Hunk was worried. They were practically crying by the time they got him bandaged up and then huddled around him, trying to keep him warm. Keith was dizzy and in pain and not following the plot very well, but he knew that he was in shock and they were doing everything they could, giving everything they could, including the shirts off their backs. Safe at last, he let himself fade. Now, coming back to himself, Keith was grateful all over again to have these two comrades with him. Yes, it would be better if they were safe, if it was only him being held captive and interrogated. Better yet, none of them at all. But since it was this way instead, he was glad for Hunk's strength and kindness, and for Lance's compassion and optimism in the face of these horrible circumstances. He really shouldn't feel safe here, locked in a cell at the mercy of ruthless enemies. But with Hunk and Lance beside him, holding him, he did. They had to get out of here. Corrales said they were going to take Hunk away again. Keith could not allow that. And that woman telling him not to try to escape just made him more determined to do it. But how? Keith felt fumbling at his wrist and opened his eyes wider. He looked blearily down at his lap, where his arm was twined with Lance. Lance had huddled closer against Keith's side, ducking his head down and pulling his knees up so that their hands and arms were enclosed in a warm, cozy space between their bodies. Lance was doing something to his cuff. Keith tried to focus his eyes, caught a glimpse of metal. The metal strip from the bed frame, the self-made tool. Keith drew in a sharp breath. "Hey," Hunk murmured above his head. "It's okay. Just relax." "Almost got it," Lance murmured in a fake language that sounded like Pig Latin, but with even more extraneous syllables. "Ooby-dooby?" Keith vaguely remembered Hunk and Lance mentioning that they both knew that game and could speak it to each other, but Keith's brain was a little slow. It took him a few long seconds to figure out what Lance was saying, and by then Hunk had already responded in the affirmative. Keith blinked, trying to take it in. He felt a distinct click that resonated in his wrist cuff and seemed to shiver through his entire body. "There," Lance said, low and satisfied. He set Keith's wrist down in his lap, very gently, and reached for his other one. What's going on?" Keith dared to ask, still not keeping up. Hunk tightened the arm he had wrapped around Keith and Lance's backs. "Lance figured out how to turn off the cuffs," he said in Pig Latin. "The next time they come for one of us, we're going to fight back." A thrill of anticipation ran through Keith's body. "Good," he said emphatically, not bothering to disguise the word. He wouldn't let them hurt Hunk again. No way, no how. Nor Lance, nor himself, come to think of it. None of them. They were getting out. But he felt the weakness in his own body, and he couldn't help a shiver of doubt. Hunk had gotten beaten up, and Lance had been electrocuted, but they had made Keith lose blood. A lot of it, if memory served. When he shifted his gaze, he could see smears of red on the floor where they had dumped him, before Hunk and Lance hauled him up and supported him between them. He left a lot behind on that table, too, and the way his vision swayed when he blinked, not a good sign. He didn't know how well he would even be able to walk, let alone fight. He was just going to have to make it work, that was all. He couldn't let Hunk and Lance get hurt anymore. Corrales could not be allowed to derive even one more second of satisfaction from exercising her power over them. Keith would consider his entire life until this moment a success if he could just deprive her of that. He felt sick to his stomach, remembering her hand on his jaw, the expression on her face when she cut him that last time. She was enjoying this far too much. It made Keith feel not just trapped and helpless, but used and soiled in a way he didn't like to contemplate. Another click as Lance released Keith's second wrist cuff. He shivered, and Lance pressed closer to him as if in response, trying to warm him up. But Keith was warm, now. It was a shiver of anticipation and fear, not cold. "Good job," Hunk murmured. He wrapped his arm farther around Keith and rubbed his hand up and down Lance's back. "You got this." If his head hadn't been ducked down, face hidden, Keith was certain he would have seen Lance beam at the praise. As it was, Lance curled up tighter, making the space between their bodies smaller and more contained. Keith raised his knees, too, and reached over for Hunk's free hand to draw it into the enclosed space. Lance fumbled for Hunk's hand for a moment, then started working on his cuff. Another click. Keith's breath came short and hard. So close. They only had to get one more of Hunk's wrists, assuming Lance had already deactivated both of his. Then they would all be free. But Lance paused. "Wait!" He switched to Ooby Dooby, speaking slowly so Keith would be able to pick it up. "Should we leave one cuff active so we'll know when the Malcordons turn them on? Otherwise we'll have no idea." They were silent for a moment, contemplating this. Keith grimaced. He didn't want any of them to have even one wrist locked down. How would they be able to fight? The next time the Malcordons opened that door, all three of them needed to be able to launch a surprise attack. It was their only hope of winning their freedom. But Lance was right. If they didn't know when the cuffs were activated, they would just sit here, and the Malcordons would know that something was up. Instead of coming in like usual, arrogant and unprepared, they would bring guns. Then their only chance would be lost. Hunk swallowed with some difficulty, but his shoulders were firm. "You're right. Leave my cuff active so we have warning. You'll have to undo it before they come in." Lance's breathing sped up just a touch. "I'll only have seconds! You're trusting me too much!" Hunk pressed his head closer into their little huddle, resting his forehead against Lance's. Both of their faces were only inches from Keith's. Keith closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the closeness, this moment that he did not feel belonged to him. But he still felt Hunk's smile, warm and slow and certain. "Never." Lance was silent, breathing. Then he nodded. And that was it. They waited. Lance and Hunk talked a bit more, strategies of how to take the guards down, though all they could do was make very general suggestions. "I go right, you go left," that sort of thing. Keith still felt dizzy, so he left his eyes closed, trying to gather as much energy as he could. He felt himself slumping against Hunk's side, limp and exhausted, head heavily on Hunk's strong shoulder. Lance and Hunk shifted so that Hunk could wrap the arm with the active cuff around Keith's body, with his hand now inside the enclosed space of their huddle, so when it activated, the guards wouldn't be able to see Lance work on it. Keith's mind drifted. How long would it be till they came back? He didn't think it would be very long. The way Corrales had questioned him, the urgency in her tone, no matter how she tried to hide it, under forcefulness and anger. She knew she was running out of time. Shiro and the others must be looking for them, no matter how well hidden this prison was, no matter how thoroughly their captors had covered their tracks. Keith knew that Shiro would find them. Corrales was cruel and heartless, but she wasn't stupid. She must have known that Shiro was on his way too. Part of Keith was afraid of the guards coming back, even though they would be coming for Hunk this time, not him. Keith had managed to repress his responses, but he didn't want to get cut again. It was too much. He didn't want to go through that again, and maybe that was cowardice. But Keith was weak and dizzy and still in pain from the last time, and he couldn't help how he felt. He shivered. Hunk hugged him tighter to his side, and Lance pressed closer too. No, it didn't matter what they did to Keith. Not really. He had to protect Hunk. He had to protect Lance. He couldn't let the Malcordons hurt them again. Keith's hands found a grip on Lance's wrist in the fabric of Hunk's pajama pants, and his fingers clenched. They wouldn't get hurt again, not while there was breath in his body. These two people, these incredible friends, they had to get out of here no matter what. They were special, and they were kind, and the way they were with each other was amazing and beautiful. Keith wanted to keep that safe, wanted it to continue forever, even if he wasn't there to see it. At last came that hum in the air, the almost inaudible buzz. Hunk's breath caught. "It's happening," he murmured. They all tensed, and Keith forced his eyes open. Things happened very quickly. The active cuff began to fall to the floor, and Keith and Lance both moved their invisible hands down too, hiding the fact that their cuffs were turned off. Lance crouched down over Hunk's trapped wrist and fumbled with the tool, trying to jam it into the cuff. Keith felt the guy's entire body shaking, and his breath was coming too fast and hard. "Lance, buddy, calm down," Hunk said, his free hand motionless on the floor where the cameras could see it. Lance took a breath and tried. Keith rolled his head on Hunk's shoulder and looked toward the door, his entire body tense. He was trembling too. They were coming. The lock disengaged and the door swung open. 2 guards. Keith looked past them into the hall, tried to see if there were any more waiting outside. He couldn't see anyone, and he seemed to remember that when they took him, there had been only 2. In fact, he only remembered seeing about half a dozen Melkordan faces in the entire time they'd been captive. Was the unit holding them actually very small and contained? The guards were coming closer, boots tromping on the stone floor. Keith watched them approach with wide eyes, his expression flat and grim. Lance was still bent over Hunk's wrist. "Quiznak!" he burst out, voice high and terrified. The guards reached for Hunk, ready to grab his arms. Click! "Got it!" Lance yelled. They exploded from their positions on the floor, all 3 of them, Hunk and Lance and Keith. The guards were frozen for a split second in surprise and indecision, eyes going wide, and that was all the time they needed. Keith put his hands together and swung them both hard, aiming for a slack jaw, while Lance's fist struck out in a hard right cross. By chance, they happened to attack the same guard, so if Keith's body was too weak from blood loss or Lance's was too shaky from electrocution, they made up for each other's lack. The guard crashed to the ground like a felled tree, and the 2 of them turned towards Hunk and found that he had already taken out his own opponent. Keith hadn't seen it happen, but Hunk had one hand raised, curled, and a fist above his head like he just bonked his guy on the top of the head like a coconut. Whatever he'd done, it had worked. Both guards were down for the moment, though Keith was sure he saw a finger twitch. It took a lot more force to knock someone out in real life than it did in the movies, and this was an alien species that might be tougher than the average human, too. They didn't wait to find out. The 3 of them were already scrambling for the hallway. Hunk took only a moment to slam the door behind them. They didn't try to lock it, just ran. Keith's eyes darted around frantically, taking in the hallway. The room where they'd tortured him was to the left, so he led the way in the opposite direction. Lance and Hunk followed him with no objection. Keith could only hope that he was moving towards an exit. He had no way to know. "Wait!" Lance gasped. His hand reached out and snagged Keith's sleeve, but Keith didn't slow down. "This is the way they took me!" Keith ground his teeth, but he had no choice but to keep going. He and Lance were the only 2 who remembered being interrogated, and it turned out that they'd been taken in opposite directions from the cell. Neither of them had seen an exit, or they would have mentioned it back when they had time to talk. They would have to wing it and hope for the best. Keith's body was already beginning to flag, the blood loss and exhaustion hitting him hard. Lance and Hunk moved up beside him, and Hunk got an arm around him, which helped. Lance ran ahead, looking this way and that with frantic jerks of his head. The hallway seemed endless. All the doors they had passed so far obviously belonged to more cells. Where was the exit, or even the interrogation rooms? Voices and footsteps behind them, shouts for them to halt, the heavy sound of boots. Lance cast a glance over his shoulder, eye wide and terrified. Another curse, stumbling, breathless from his lips. Keith didn't look back, didn't want to see. He just watched Lance, watched the walls flying by on both sides. They turned a corner, and here the walls changed. No longer the dark stone of the cell area. The walls were light gray instead. White doors, some inscribed with words in Melkordan script. Keith didn't recognize this area, but Lance did. His steps slowed, and he looked around more deliberately, as if he was searching for something. This is where they took me!" The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Then Lance came to a halt so suddenly that Hunk and Keith almost ran into him. Lance was shaking all over, fist clenched at his sides. Keith opened his mouth to urge him on, but then he saw what Lance was looking at, and he shut his lips. Dead end. Up ahead was a wall of bars cutting across the hallway, trapping them inside. The bars must not have been here last time Lance traveled this hallway, maybe retracted into the walls. But when they escaped their cells, of course the Malcordons had cut off all escape routes. And there, on the other side, stalking toward them, Corrales. It was Corrales. Her head was down, fists clenched as she paced toward them like a predator on the prowl, her face frozen in a mask of anger and pleasure. She was happy to see them. She was going to hurt them, and she looked forward to doing it. Lance's breath caught in his throat. Keith was so dizzy he could barely see. Then Lance turned and flung himself back down the hallway. "Here!" he yelled. "Here, this is where they took me!" Another door like all the others. It wasn't locked. Lance threw it open and darted inside, and Hunk and Keith followed. Lance slammed the door shut, falling on it with both hands, then turned to the control panel beside the door. He slapped it with his palm, then did something else with swift motions of his fingers, and Keith heard the lock engage. Hunk stood still on the floor, still supporting the majority of Keith's weight as Keith's knees bent beneath him. Keith looked around the room, hopeful despite himself. Maybe there was another doorway, an exit, a window, even an air vent. But the walls were bare and institutional, and the furnishings inside. He recognized the chair from Lance's description, and the machine. It did look like something out of a Saturday morning cartoon, huge and overblown and terrifying. But it was real. This machine had been used to electrocute Lance, to pour electricity through his brain in an attempt to study the bond he had with Blue, and it had left him unconscious and bleeding for far too long. "Lance," Hunk said, and there was a fear in his voice that Keith didn't quite understand. "Why did you choose this room? We could have picked another one if we were just going to barricade ourselves in and hope for rescue." Lance looked at him, eyes wide, just short of panic. His hands kept clenching and unclenching at his sides. He licked his dry lips and tried to say something, then stopped. Keith's heart felt heavy in his chest. He began to understand. "Lance, no." His voice was soft and breathless, nearly inaudible. "Don't." Lance turned to look at him full on, and his smile was regretful. "I have an idea." Keith shook his head, and he felt Hunk doing it too. "No, Lance, don't do this. It could have killed you last time. It almost did." Lance looked back at the chair. He lifted his foot to take a step toward it, then stopped. "This is the only way. I have to supercharge the bond again and talk to Blue." "Lance!" Hunk's voice was rough on the edge of tears. "Come on. It hurt you. It hurt you so bad, sweetheart. Keith and I, we both saw it. We were so scared. Please don't put yourself through that again." Lance turned back to Hunk. His eyes were soft. He smiled, shaky, for Hunk, and not for himself. "You don't understand. This will work. I know it will. Blue is... She's looking for me, Hunk. I can feel it. She's out there and she's looking for me. All I gotta do is reach out a tiny bit farther and she'll know it. She'll hear me and she'll come straight here. And you'd better believe she'll tear this place apart until she finds me. Nothing will keep her out."
"But what if it doesn't work?"
Hunk asked desperately. He was holding onto Keith so tightly that it was beginning to hurt, his fingers digging into Keith's flesh.
"What if all it does is scramble your brain and burst something, so you'll bleed and bleed like last time, except it won't stop? What if that happens and you still can't reach Blue? Then...
"You could die," he didn't say, but Keith heard it. They were trapped deep in an enemy base with no backup, no exit route, and no supplies. If one of them was mortally wounded, they had no way to get to a cryo replenisher in time. Any mistake here was a dead end of another kind.
"Lance,"
Keith said. He tried to keep his voice calm, but he felt it shaking.
"We can find another way. We'll barricade ourselves in here and wait for Shiro and the others. Shiro is on his way. I know he is. Same as you know Blue is searching. I know Shiro is on his way. We can wait it out."
Lance bit his lip. He wanted to believe him. He obviously dreaded doing this as much as Keith and Hunk dreaded him doing it.
Or we could keep fighting. Keith went on, almost desperate to convince him. We'll improvise weapons from stuff in this room and we'll take them all out. I'm sure you noticed, too. The crew holding us isn't that big. There are 6, maybe 8 guys. We can take them out.
That we've seen, Lance said gently. We haven't even been here a whole day. No knowing if there's a shift change, if there's backup. We can't depend just on what we've seen.
Keith grit his teeth. Then we'll hide. Something. Don't risk your life on a chance that might not even work out. Please.
He was shaking hard now. He didn't want to watch Lance in pain, and he didn't want to watch him die. Keith? Hunk? Lance walked back over them and put a hand on both of their shoulders. He looked in their faces, from one to the other, and his expression was settling as he did it, as if he found strength there. As if strength was flowing from their bodies through his fingers, steadying his nerves and hardening his resolve. Lance drew a breath. I appreciate it, I do. But neither of those plans will work. Not for long enough.
Lance.
Hunk was almost crying. Lance squeezed Keith's shoulder and gave him an understanding look, then turned back to Hunk. I know Shiro is on his way. I'm sure of it. But we're in enemy territory, at a dead end, locked in a single room without an exit. They'll get through the lock soon. I tried to scramble the code, but they own this place. It won't take them long. And we can't fight. Hunk is the only one of us anywhere near full strength, and he can't take on an entire base of enemy soldiers. A little laugh stuttered out of his mouth. He doesn't even have a shirt. Loud pounding started at the door, and Keith jolted in terror, eyes flying to it. Hunk and Lance looked too, breath halting for a moment, then looked back at each other. The door held for now, but Lance was right. It wouldn't last for long. Lance's face was grim. If they catch us again, they'll hurt us. All of us. I can't see that again. I can't watch it. I won't. We have to get away. No waiting. I need to talk to Blue. She'll come and save us. It'll be the work of moments. I swear. I know this will work. I know it. Keith held his breath. Then Hunk's shoulders slumped, and it was clear that the decision was made. Lance. I know. Soft. Lance let go of Keith's shoulder and put both arms around Hunk's torso, pressing his face into his shoulder. It's gonna be okay, Hunky Bear. Hunk laughed, damp and teary-eyed. One arm stayed under Keith's armpits to hold him up, but the other wrapped around Lance and squeezed, powerful and rough.
Do you stay up at night and think of new pet names for me?
Maybe. Lance's voice held a bit of mischief here at the end. The pounding at the door intensified. He leaned back and smiled into Hunk's face. Help me? Someone will have to activate the machine. Hunk's breath shuddered, but he nodded.
But I'm not strapping you into that chair.
His voice was hard. Lance shivered. Agreed. I didn't want you to anyway. I'm doing this voluntarily. I won't try to take off the headset. They walked over to the chair, to the machine. Keith's knees were steadier now, though he was unable to speak. He slipped away from Hunk's arm, let him stand with Lance. They hugged again close and tight before Lance climbed into the chair and sat back. Lance's face was relaxed, ready, but Keith read the tension in his shoulders, the jump of his knee. Hunk gave him the headset, and Lance put it on. Then Hunk turned to stare at the machine, taking in all of the buttons and levers and dials with an engineer's eye. There were shouts on the other side of the door now, the sound of a loud tool, something like a buzzsaw. Keith deliberately did not turn to look. Hunk found the correct switch. His hand reached out, though it didn't touch down yet. He looked at Lance, eyes large and liquid with pain. He was waiting for Lance's signal. Lance held still and breathed hard for a moment. Then he braced himself, hands clenching on the chair's armrests. He nodded. Hunk threw the switch.